Part 2. Here is the Evil. Chapter 12. Surprise in the Science Lab. "We'll have to do this on the honor system," Mr. Adams said, winking at Corky as he handed her the exam. Seated on a tall metal stool, Corky leaned forward over the lab table and took the exam from the teacher. "What do you mean?" she asked, studying his face. Mr. Adams was young, in his mid-20s, but his dark brown hair was already graying at the sides, and his mustache, which rested over his top lip like one of the bushy caterpillars they had studied in biology, was also sprinkled with gray. He had friendly brown eyes, a nice smile, and usually dressed in jeans and oversized sweaters. He was a tough teacher, demanding, but well-liked. "I have to go pick up my car at the service garage," he told her. "I should be back in 20 minutes, half an hour at the most." He lifted his down jacket off a chair. Corky glanced quickly at the test. 6 essay questions. No real surprises. "I'll try not to cheat too much while you're gone," she joked. Mr. Adam chuckled. He pulled the bulky jacket on over his sweater. "Those frogs are noisy, aren't they?" he asked, pointing to the big frog case on the shelf against the wall. 6 or 8 frogs were croaking throatily. "Whoever told them they could sing?" "They'll keep me company," Corky replied, watching the creatures hopping around behind the glass. "How long do I have for the exam?" "It shouldn't take more than an hour," he said. "It's way too easy." "Yeah, right," she said, laughing. He gave her a quick wave, pointed to the paper as if to say, "Get to work," and hurried out of the lab. The room grew silent except for the rhythmic croaking of the frogs. Corky turned her eyes to the windows that ran along the wall to her right. Shards of December sunlight slanted into the room through the Venetian blinds, falling onto the large tropical fish tank in the corner. Beside it stood a human skeleton, hunched on its stand, its shoulders slumped forward, its knees bent, as if it were weary. Shelves beside the skeleton held large specimen jars filled with insects, plant specimens, and all kinds of animal parts. Corky made a disgusted face, remembering the cow eyeball Mr. Adams had shown them earlier that afternoon. It was so enormous, so blobby. She glanced up at the clock. A little past 3:30. Cheerleading practice would be starting in the gym. She tapped her pencil rapidly on the tabletop, thinking about her long conversation with Kimmy the night before. Then, scolding herself for wasting time, she lowered her eyes to the exam and read the first question. "Good," she said out loud, seeing that it was about osmosis. She had studied osmosis well. She knew everything there was to know about it. She scooted the stool closer to the counter. Then she wrote the number 1 at the top of the page. "Hey!" she cried out, startled as the door to the room slammed shut. Had Mr. Adams returned already? She spun around to see. No one there. Someone out in the corridor must have closed it. She glanced up at the clock. 3:35. "I'm wasting time," she said, and began to write. The singing of the frogs seemed to grow louder. Glancing up with a sigh, Corky saw that the frogs were all hopping around wildly in their glass case, splashing each other, grappling onto one another's backs. "Thanks for the help, guys," she said dryly, rolling her eyes. "What's your problem, anyway?" She returned her attention to the test paper. Then the Venetian blinds all slammed shut at once. The clatter made Corky drop her pencil. It fell to the floor and rolled under the table. "Hey!" The room was much darker without the sunlight. Corky slid off the stool and dropped to her knees to retrieve her pencil. When she stood up, the overhead lights flickered off. "What?" Corky blinked. Total darkness now. The frogs sang louder. Corky covered her ears with her hands. "What's going on? Is someone here?" The singing of the frogs was the only reply. She stood, uncertain, leaning against the tall lab table. Her eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light. Is there a blackout? She wondered out loud. Then she heard an unfamiliar pop, pop, pop. It took her a while to realize it was the sound of the glass lids popping off the specimen jars. She saw the lids fly up to the ceiling, then crash back to the floor, the glass shattering, flying across the floor. The contents of the jars floated up. Hundreds of dead flies rose up from one jar and darkened the air. Dozens of caterpillars followed them, floating silently in formation like a flock of birds. The croaking became deafening. As she stared in disbelief, Corky realized that the frogs were free. Their glass case had also shattered. About 24 of them were leaping over the countertops, scrabbling toward her. "Help!" Corky managed to yell. She gasped as something large and soft plopped onto the counter in front of her, splashed her, spread stickily over her test paper. The cow eyeball. It stared up at her as if watching her. The frogs were on her countertop too, leaping over one another, climbing onto the disgusting eyeball, crying out their excitement. The Venetian blinds began to clatter noisily, open, shut, flying out into the room as if blown by the wind even though all the windows were closed. Sunlight flashed on and off as fast as Corky could blink. "I have to get out of here," she told herself. She brushed a croaking frog off her shoulder. Another one leapt at her face. The cow eyeball rose up, plopped down again, then rose up as if trying to fly. With a disgusted cry, Corky ducked as the wet eyeball flew at her face. It floated over her head. She could feel it spray her hair. Then she heard it land with a sickening plop on the floor. She had started running to the door when something at the front of the room caught her eye. The skeleton. It was no longer hunched over. It was standing straight, straining to free itself from its pedestal. Corky grabbed the doorknob and pulled. The door wouldn't budge. "Help!" she gasped as the room filled with a foul odor that invaded her nostrils, choked her throat. So sour, sour as death. She tried the door again. "Help me! Is someone out there?" Silence. "Please, help me!" And then, over the clatter of the flying Venetian blinds and the mad croaking of the frogs, she heard a disgusting crack. So dry, the sound of cracking bones. And, looking to the front of the room, Corky saw one bony hand break off the skeleton. She watched, frozen in horror, as the hand, its fingers coiling and uncoiling as if limbering up, floated up over the countertops. The now handless skeleton continued to strain against its stand, attempting to free itself. The bony hand flew toward Corky as if shot from a gun. Corky tried to cry out, tried to duck, but the hand zoomed in on her, flew over the wildly hopping frogs, over the quivering eyeball, through the curtain of dead insects that choked the air. The hand slammed into her, grabbed her by the throat. The force of the collision sent her sprawling against the door. "Help me! Somebody!" she shrieked in a voice she no longer recognized. And then the fingers tightened around her throat. The cold, bony hand squeezed tighter, 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 until she could no longer breathe. Chapter 13. Cut. Corky noisily tried to suck in a breath, but the bony fingers dug farther into her throat, tightening their already steely grip. The room pulsed with noise. The clanking of the fluttering blinds competed with the frantic croaking of the frogs. The light brightened again, then dimmed, then stayed dim as the hand choked off the last of Corky's air. She whirled around and tried to slam the hand against the wall. Then she reached up with both hands and grabbed the hand at the wrist. It felt so cold, cold and damp, as if it had just risen from a wet grave. The room spun. The dark ceiling appeared to lower on her. Corky grabbed the wrist with both hands and tugged. The bony fingers dug deeper into her throat, squeezing tighter. She reached for the fingers, grabbed two in each hand, and pulled with all her might. The sickening sound of bones cracking gave Corky some hope. Suddenly, she could breathe. She noisily sucked in air, exhaled, sucked in more. The broken fingers grasped frantically for her, but their hold was weak. She grabbed the cold wrist, pulled the broken hand off, and heaved it across the room. Then, with a cry of horror, of disbelief, of relief all mixed in one, Corky lurched for the doorknob again and frantically turned it. This time, the door opened. She found herself in the dark, silent corridor. She slammed the lab door hard behind her. Her heart pounded, the only sound now. Her eyes were clouded by tears. She pushed her hair back from her face and started to run. "Chip!" she said out loud. "Chip!" He had told her he'd be working late in the wood shop. They had made plans to meet there after her exam. "Chip!" Off balance, the floor tilted ahead of her. Corky started to run down the long hallway, her footsteps echoing loudly. She was breathing noisily through her open mouth. "Chip!" She rubbed her throbbing throat as she ran. The bony fingers were gone, but she could still feel them pressing against her, so cold and wet, until she couldn't breathe. "Chip!" The shop was downstairs at the back of the building. She stumbled on the first step, but thrust out both hands and caught herself on the railing. "Isn't anyone here?" she wondered. The vast school building was so silent that she imagined she could hear her thoughts echoing in the hall. Down the stairs and along the shorter hallway, the double doors to the shop came into view. The silence gave way to a high-pitched roar, a steady whine. "What is that noise?" Corky wondered. She pushed her way through the double doors, bumping them open with her body, and lunged into the shop. "Chip, where are you?" she cried, her voice revealing her terror. "Chip!" The steady roar grew louder, closer. Her eyes darted over the work tables, the pile of lumber against the side wall, the tall power drills, the safety goggles hanging on their pegs. "Chip, where are you? Are you here?" She made her way into the center of the big room, her sneakers sliding over the fragrant sawdust on the floor. She came to a halt at the dark puddle. "What is that?" She stared down at it. It took her a long time to realize she was staring at a puddle of blood. Then she saw 2 shoes on the floor. Legs, almost hidden behind a work table. Taking a deep breath, she made her way around the dark puddle to get a better view. She cried out when she saw Chip lying face down in a larger puddle of blood. A lake of dark blood. "Oh!" She grabbed the top of the work table, leaned against it, forced herself not to drop down beside him. "Chip!" She could tell that he was dead. Chip was dead, sprawled there in his own blood. She had to look away. She couldn't keep on staring at him. She glanced up and saw the power saw, and realized the steady whirring sound came from the power saw. The blade was spinning loudly. Louder. Even louder. And then Corky's ear-piercing screams drowned out the roar of the whirring saw blade as she caught sight of Chip's severed hand. Chip's hand, cut off at the wrist, rested like a glove beside the blade. Chapter 14. Where is the evil spirit? Corky didn't cry at Chip's funeral. She was all cried out. She had cried until her eyes burned and her cheeks were red and swollen. And then, suddenly, her tears were gone, as if she'd used up her lifetime's supply. She was hollow now, drained of all emotion, except for the sadness. The sadness remained, and behind it lurked the terror, the frightening memories, the terrifying scenes that she knew would remain forever in her mind. The thought followed her everywhere she went, kept her wide awake at night. Something was wrong in the world. Something was there, in her life, something evil. Something inhuman. Something out of control. After the funeral, she walked by herself from the small chapel out into a gray, blustery day. A circle of swirling brown leaves danced over her shoes as she stepped onto the sidewalk. Dead leaves. Death. Everywhere. Corky turned up the collar of her coat, more to hide her face than to protect herself from the gusting winds. She jammed her frozen hands deep into her coat pockets and started to walk. "Hey, Corky!" Kimmy came jogging up to her, her black crimped hair bobbing, her cheeks bright red, her dark eyes watery and red-rimmed. Without saying a word, Kimmy threw her arms around Corky's shoulders and hugged her, pressing her warm cheek against Corky's cold face. After a few seconds, Kimmy stepped back awkwardly, shaking her head. "It's so awful," she whispered. She squeezed the arm of Corky's coat. "And you found him. You were the one who—" Her voice caught in her throat. "I'm so sorry, Corky." Corky lowered her eyes to the pavement. More brown leaves scrabbled over her shoes, tossed by the wind. Ronnie and Heather appeared, their faces pale, their expressions grim. Kimmy hugged them both. They offered low-voiced greetings to Corky. Then the three girls headed off towards Kimmy's blue Camry, parked across the street. "Call me," Kimmy called to Corky. "Okay." She didn't wait for a reply. Corky watched them climb into Kimmy's car. She saw all three of them talking at once inside the car. As they talked, they kept stealing glances at Corky. Corky turned away and started to walk. She had gone several steps before she realized she wasn't alone. "Hi, Corky," Deborah said. Her cold blue eyes peered out at Corky from under the hood of the black cape she had taken to wearing. Deborah always was pale and fragile, but today she almost appeared ghost-like. "Come talk to me," she said, her voice barely rising over the rush of the wind. Corky shook her head. "I really don't feel like talking." She started to walk away. Deborah hurried to keep up with her. The wind blew back her hood, revealing her short blonde hair. "We have to talk, Corky. We have to," she insisted. "But Deborah—" "Over there." Deborah grabbed Corky's arm and pointed toward a small diner across the street. "Just for a few minutes. We'll grab a hamburger or something to drink. I'll buy, okay?" Deborah was pleading, so hard that Corky felt she had no choice. "Okay," she said, sighing. "Actually, I haven't eaten today." A pleased smile crossed Deborah's face as she grabbed Corky's arm and pulled her across the street. A few minutes later, they were seated in a tiny booth, their coats folded beside them. Deborah was eating a bacon cheeseburger and French fries. Corky, realizing she wasn't as hungry as she thought, took a few spoonfuls from a bowl of vegetable soup. "People say such dumb things at funerals," Deborah said, wiping ketchup off her chin with a napkin. "I heard someone tell Chip's mom that it was a really good funeral." She shook her head. "Now what's that supposed to mean?" Corky stared down at the soup. "I don't know. I think people feel so uncomfortable at funerals, they don't know what they're saying," she told Deborah. "People said some pretty weird things to me at Bobby's funeral." Bobby's funeral. Chip's funeral. There had been so many funerals in her life recently. She forced down a few more spoonfuls of soup. It didn't taste great, but the warm liquid was soothing on her throat. "We have to talk about the evil spirit," Deborah said, suddenly, lowering her voice even though they were the only customers in the diner. Corky sighed. "Yeah, I know." She stirred her soup, but knew she couldn't eat any more. "You and I both know the evil spirit killed Chip," Deborah said heatedly. he didn't accidentally cut off his hand and stand there bleeding to death without calling for help or anything. The doctor said he probably sawed off his hand and then went into shock, Corky said. Do you believe that? Deborah demanded. Corky hesitated, then shook her head. No. For one thing, Chip was a careful guy. He wouldn't stand there and slice off his entire hand. I know, Corky said, her voice catching in her throat. Also, do you know how hard it would be to slice your hand clean off? If you just nicked your wrist, you'd pull away immediately. You wouldn't keep right on sawing, she exclaimed. Deborah, please. Corky turned her eyes to the front of the diner. Through the window, she could see that wet flakes of snow had started to fall. The evil is still alive, Corky, Deborah continued. I know it. Kimmy knows it. And you know it. We can't just ignore it. We can't pretend it isn't there and hope it will go away and everything will be nice again. I know, Corky wailed. I know better than anyone, Deborah. Deborah reached across the tabletop and squeezed Corky's hand. Sorry, I just meant the evil revealed itself to me, Corky told her. Just before I found Chip. Deborah lowered her cheeseburger to the plate. She stared at Corky as if trying to read her mind. What do you mean? Corky took a deep breath and told her everything that had happened in the science lab, starting with the door slamming shut and the lights going out, ending with her desperate struggle with the skeleton's hand. Deborah listened in silence, resting her chin in her hands. Both girls ignored their food while Corky told her frightening story. I don't believe it, Deborah said softly. I don't believe it. There's more, Corky said softly, raising her eyes to the window in front. The snow was turning to a bleak, wet drizzle. Go on, Deborah urged. Please. Corky told her about her encounters with John Daly and Sarah Beth Plummer. Then she told about driving past the Fear Street Cemetery, about seeing Sarah Beth and John in the cemetery together. What were they doing? Deborah asked, removing her chin from her hands and sitting up straight. I don't know, Corky told her. It was so strange. I saw Sarah Beth perform a dance on Sarah Fear's grave. You mean while John was watching? Deborah asked. John leaned on the gravestone and watched, Corky said. It was so creepy. The evil spirit is definitely alive, Deborah said in a whisper. But where? Corky asked. Why didn't it stay down in the grave? Where is it? I think I know how to find it, Deborah said mysteriously. Chapter 15. Razzmatazz.
We've got razzmatazz, pep, punch, and pizzazz. Hey, you! You've been had. Shadyside Tiger's got razzmatazz. Razzmatazz!
As they repeated razzmatazz, the 5 cheerleaders performed flying splits. Then they landed on their feet and, with a whooping cheer, ran to the sidelines clapping. Wow! That was awesome! Corky cried, pushing up the sleeves of her tiger's sweatshirt as she moved toward them.
How about the flying splits?
Kimmy asked, her expression concerned.
High enough? I had the feeling Megan and I were a little late.
Looked excellent to me, Corky told her, grinning. Don't be so hard on yourselves.
Yeah,
Ronnie piped up.
If Corky says it was awesome, it was awesome.
Everyone laughed. Kimmy has really improved, Corky thought happily. She's much more graceful. She even lost some weight. It was nearly 4 weeks after Chip's funeral, and Kimmy had persuaded Corky to come to cheerleading practice once again.
We all have to stick together,
Kimmy had urged Corky.
If we're going to find the evil, if we're going to fight it, we have to work together. If you're not on the squad, you're not really with us. You're alone.
Kimmy's words had touched Corky, had convinced her. Now here she was, ready to give it another try. The girls, dressed in tights, denim cutoffs, and oversized t-shirts, seemed relaxed and enthusiastic, and glad to see Corky again.
You ready to try the new routine now?
Kimmy asked Corky. Corky didn't hesitate. Yeah, I'm ready. This time, she wasn't going to be stopped. She knew that next Saturday night was one of the last basketball games of the season. If she was going to get back on the squad, it was now or never. Corky glanced across the brightly lit gym. Standing against the wall outside her office, Miss Green flashed her a thumbs-up sign. Corky returned the signal and stepped into line next to Kimmy. You have to help me with the hand claps, she said. I think I'm straight on everything else.
I never get them right either,
Kimmy joked, giving Corky an encouraging smile. Waiting for Kimmy to begin the cheer, Corky felt a moment of panic. The bright gym seemed to fade behind a curtain of white light. Silence seemed to encircle her. I'm all alone, she thought, all by myself out here. But then the cheer began. The white light dimmed, and the rest of the world returned.
We've got Razzmatazz, Pep, Punch, and Pizzazz. Hey, you! You've been had. Shadyside Tiger's got Razzmatazz.
Shouting at the top of her lungs, Corky moved easily through the routine. And when it came to the finale of flying splits, she timed her jump perfectly and leapt higher and cleaner than any of the other girls. The routine ended with a whooping cheer, and the girls jogged to the sidelines clapping. Corky took a deep breath and realized she was laughing from sheer joy, from the happiness of being able to perform an entire routine. Before she realized what was happening, she was surrounded by the others. They were laughing too, eager to congratulate her, to compliment her on her performance, to welcome her back.
Now that you're back, we can do the Diamond Head Pyramid again, Kimmy exclaimed. You know, the one you and your sister invented.
Yeah, let's try it, Corky said with enthusiasm.
Now?
Kimmy asked, expressing her surprise. Yeah, right now, Corky insisted, smiling. If we're going to do the pyramid Saturday night at the game, we'd better start now.
You'll have to run us through it,
Kimmy said uncertainly. Corky saw Deborah and Ronnie whispering intensely near the wall. No problem, Corky said, signaling everyone to follow her to the center of the floor. Bobby and I spent so much time on this routine, I think I could do it in my sleep. Who's going to take the top? Ronnie asked, stretching her legs. I will, Corky told her. She saw the doubt form on Kimmy's face.
Corky,
Kimmy whispered confidentially, leaning close.
Are you sure? Don't you want to take it easy?
No, Corky shook her head, emphatically, and stepped back from Kimmy. Either I'm going to be back on the squad just like before, or I'm not, she insisted. Kimmy quickly relented. Maybe we should warm up a bit first, Deborah suggested. You know, do some roll-ups into partner pyramids before we try a big pyramid. She cast Corky a pleading look. We're already warmed up, Corky replied.
Corky's right,
Kimmy told Deborah.
Let's just do it, guys.
Corky quickly outlined the pyramid to them. 3 girls, Kimmy, Deborah, and Heather, formed the bottom tier. 2 girls, Megan and Ronnie, would stand on their shoulders, then move into liberties, each girl raising her outside foot and holding it up as Corky mounted to the top to stand on Megan's and Ronnie's shoulders. They all worked on shoulder mounts and dismounts for a few minutes. Then Corky guided them into position for the pyramid. I wish Bobby were here, she found herself thinking. She was the real expert at getting this going. But then she pushed Bobby from her mind, shaking her head hard as if shaking her thoughts away. Ready? She called. Let's try it now. Take it slowly. Don't worry about the timing.
Heather, bend your knees,
Kimmy instructed as Megan and Ronnie performed their shoulder mounts to form the middle tier. Before she realized it, it was Corky's turn to move. Before she realized it, she was climbing into position off the floor, climbing so high. And even with all her concentration, her thoughts came rushing back, the fears, the memories, the questions. Will I start to hear the screaming girl again? Will I freeze up at the top? Will the room start to spin or go crazy? Megan and Ronnie each grabbed one of Corky's hands and tugged. Corky stepped off Kimmy's shoulders and climbed. Higher. Uh-oh, she thought. Now is when the trouble comes. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. She held her breath. Her temples throbbed. She could feel the panic well up. Could feel it deaden her legs. Could feel the fear rise up from her stomach, tighten her throat. She could feel it pulse at her temples, hear it ring in her ears. Uh-oh. Now is when the trouble comes. Now. Now! She stiffened her knees and raised her hands high. Balance. She concentrated with all of her will. Uh-oh. Now! And there she was, on top of the pyramid. Shaky, but there. No voices. No spinning walls. No shrieks of terror. No evil. "Congratulations!" Corky heard a voice call from the floor. "Excellent!" She peered down to see Miss Green applauding, a broad smile on her usually dour face. "Now, watch the dismount. Take it slow, okay?" A few seconds later, the girls were on the floor, congratulating one another enthusiastically. Even Miss Green joined in the celebration. "We did it! And no broken bones!" Corky exclaimed. To Corky's surprise, Kimmy threw her arms around her and smothered her in a warm hug. "I knew you could do it!" Kimmy gushed, and then, in a whisper, she added in her ear, "Maybe the evil has left us. Maybe the nightmare is finally over." "Carry these for me," Deborah said, handing the bundle of slender red candles to Kimmy. Deborah wrapped her black cloak tighter around her neck. The full moon rose over the trees. The wind sent dry leaves scampering over the weeds and tall grass. Behind them on the street, a car rolled silently by, only one headlamp lighting its way.
"I can't believe you talked me into this,"
Kimmy said grumpily.
"This is so stupid."
"We'll go back to my house afterward," Corky offered. "We can order pizza." "Stop complaining. The weather's not so bad," Deborah said, leading the way up the hill. The dead grass clung to their boots. Somewhere in the distance, the wind toppled a garbage can. The lid clattered noisily. A cat wailed, sounding human, like a baby. The three girls stopped at the front walk. The concrete broken and crumbling. They stared up at the ruins of the old mansion. "Wow," Corky whispered. "I've never been this close." The stone walls of the mansion were charred black, evidence of the fire that had destroyed it decades before. All the windows had been blown out. Only the front one was boarded up with a large sheet of plywood. The rest were gaping holes, revealing darkness behind the crumbling walls.
"Hey, look!"
Kimmy bent down and picked up something from the dead grass beside the broken wall. Corky shone the flashlight on it. It was a doll, wide-eyed and bald, one arm missing. "It looks old," Deborah said, examining it closely. Kimmy dropped it to the ground.
"What are we doing here?"
she repeated.
"Look at this dump!"
"I know what I'm doing," Deborah replied mysteriously. She gripped a large black-covered book in her hand, gesturing with it toward the door. "Let's go inside."
"I don't think so,"
Kimmy said unhappily. Her eyes surveyed the burned walls. "Come on," Corky said, tugging at Kimmy's arm. "It's worth a try." "I know what I'm doing," Deborah repeated seriously. "Visiting the Simon Fear mansion makes perfect sense to me."
"None of this makes perfect sense,"
Kimmy grumbled, shifting the candles to her other hand.
"How can going into this burnt-out old wreck on the coldest night of the year make any sense?"
"Do you want to locate the evil spirit, or don't you?" Deborah snapped, losing her patience for the first time. "We do," Corky answered quickly.
"What makes you think we're going to find it here?"
Kimmy demanded. She kicked the old doll away. It bounced across the walk and lay sprawled face down in the grass. Sarah Fear spent a lot of time in this house, Deborah explained. If the evil spirit is hers, this is the most logical place for it to hang out.
Logical,
Kimmy muttered sarcastically. You're being a bad sport, Corky scolded. This is better than studying for the history exam, isn't it? Deborah focused on Corky, a hurt expression on her face, which was shrouded in the black hood of her cape. You don't believe me either? You're not taking this seriously? I take the evil spirit very seriously, Corky told her in a low, somber voice. I want to know where it is. That's why I agreed to come with you.
I take it seriously too, Kimmy insisted. But I don't think we're going to get anywhere poking around and lighting a bunch of candles in this burned-out old mansion.
Well, we have to do something, Corky cried heatedly. Maybe Deborah's idea is dumb, and maybe it isn't. Let's face it, Kimmy, we're desperate. We've got to act. We can't just sit around and wait to see which one of us it kills next. Corky's speech appeared to affect Kimmy.
You're right,
she said softly, and her expression turned thoughtful as she followed the other two toward the house. I've been reading a lot, Deborah said, making her way through the tall weeds to the front door, holding the book in front of her, pressing it against her chest as if for protection. This book tells how to raise a spirit. This house is the place to raise Sarah Fear's spirit. She tugged the old wooden door, and it suddenly pulled open easily. A damp, sour smell invaded their nostrils.
I can't go in there. Really?
Kimmy insisted, taking a few steps back, her features twisted in disgust. Here, I'll give you the flashlight, Corky offered. Trade you for the candles.
Having the flashlight won't help,
Kimmy replied, staring into the darkness behind the open front door.
Don't you know the stories about this place? This whole house is evil.
The spirits are alive here, Deborah said, her eyes glowing in the beam of the flashlight. I can feel them. I know we're going to succeed. Corky followed her into the house. Kimmy, her hand on Corky's shoulder, reluctantly entered too.
Yuck! It smells in here, she complained.
You'll get used to it, Deborah said quietly. She led them through the wide entryway that opened into a large sitting room. Corky shone the flashlight around the room. Wallpaper curled down from the walls, streaked with black. Dark stains covered the ceiling, which bulged and dropped. The floorboards were cracked and broken. Watch your step, Corky warned. Look, there are holes in the floor. The air felt heavy and wet. The smell of mildew and decay surrounded them. The rotting floorboards creaked as the girls made their way to the center of the room. This is great, Deborah exclaimed, taking a deep sniff of the sour air, her eyes glowing with excitement. I can feel the evil spirit. I really can.
I can smell it,
Kimmy said sarcastically. Hand me the candles, Deborah said. She placed the book on the floor and took the candles from Kimmy. Shine the light down on the book, okay? I've got to find the right page, Deborah instructed as she flipped through the pages. Corky felt a cold chill run down her back. It feels so evil in here, she said, surveying the fire-stained walls, the broken floorboards. We each take a candle, Deborah instructed. She handed Corky and Kimmy each a red one, then lighted all three. We kneel in the center of the room, she said, lowering her voice to a whisper. Corky and Kimmy obediently knelt beside Deborah. Hold the candle in your left hand, Deborah instructed. Then we put our right hand forward and clasped them in the center. The girls followed these directions. Suddenly, the flames dipped low and nearly went out. Corky gasped and let go of Kimmy's hand. You felt it too? Deborah asked, excited. You felt the spirit?
It was just the wind, Kimmy said, rolling her eyes. Give us a break.
Try to concentrate, Kimmy, Deborah scolded. We need total concentration. I can locate the spirit here. I know I can. But we have to concentrate.
I'm concentrating,
Kimmy muttered. They held hands again. The candle flames dipped once more. This time, none of the girls reacted. I'm going to chant now, Deborah told them. When I finish the chant, the book says we should know where the evil spirit is. Corky swallowed hard. The rotting floorboards creaked. The candle flames dipped, then stood tall again. This is going to work, Corky thought. The spirit of Sarah Fear has to be somewhere in this frightening old place.
Give it the old razzmatazz,
Kimmy told Deborah. Deborah glared at Kimmy. Shh! She raised a finger to her lips and held it there. Then, closing her eyes, she wrapped both hands around her candle and began to chant. The flickering light played over her pale, pretty face under the black hood. She chanted in a language Corky didn't recognize. At first, her voice was soft, but it grew louder and stronger as she continued to chant. Her eyes still closed, Deborah began to move the candle in a circle in front of her, still gripping it with both hands. Around and around, slowly, slowly, while chanting louder and louder. Gripping the candle in her left hand and Kimmy's hand in her right, Corky stared straight ahead, concentrating on Deborah's strange, musical words. After a few minutes, Deborah finished her chant. She opened her eyes, and all three girls cried out as the evil spirit rose from a hole in the rotting floor. Chapter 16. He disappeared. Corky leapt to her feet, staring straight ahead through the darkness as the creature struggled to rise into the room. Her mouth open in horror, Kimmy grabbed the flashlight and aimed it at the hole in the floor. The creature whimpered and scratched at the floorboards. "It's a dog!" Corky cried. Deborah's face fell. Corky and Kimmy rushed forward and worked to pull the dog out of the hole in the floor.
You smelly thing,
Kimmy said, petting its head and scratching its ears.
How did you get stuck down there?
The dog, a forlorn-looking mutt with damp tangles of long brown fur, licked Kimmy's nose appreciatively. "Don't let him lick you, Kimmy," Corky teased. "You don't know where he's been." "A dog. I don't believe it," Deborah said, sighing. Wagging its shaggy tail, the dog circled the room excitedly, sniffing furiously along the floor.
"Maybe he smells the evil spirit,"
Kimmy said sarcastically to Deborah. "Not funny," Deborah muttered, gathering up the candles. "I really thought we were close to something." "Me too," Corky said, watching the dog as it lopped out of the room. "I was so scared when we heard the thing start to come up from the floorboards."
"Bow wow,"
Kimmy said dryly, rolling her eyes. "I'm not giving up," Deborah insisted.
"I am,"
Kimmy said emphatically.
"I'm freezing."
She handed the flashlight back to Corky and started toward the front door. "Kimmy, wait!" Corky called. "Want to come to my house?" Kimmy turned back and shook her head.
"No thanks. I'm going home and getting into a hot bath."
"But—" "Let her go," Deborah said glumly.
"See you in school tomorrow,"
Kimmy called from the front entryway, then disappeared from view. Corky turned back to Deborah, who slammed her book shut and tucked it under her arm. "I was so psyched," she told Corky. "So psyched." "Me too," Corky said. "We're the only ones who know the evil spirit is loose," Deborah said, heading to the front. "The only ones." "Yeah, you're right," Corky agreed sadly. "My own parents change the subject every time I try to tell them the truth." "That's why we have to do something," Deborah said. "I just keep thinking about Sarah Beth Plummer and John Daly," Corky said with a shudder. She pulled up the collar of her down coat and buried her face inside it like a turtle as she followed Deborah to the door. They stepped outside, surprised to find it warmer there than in the house. "Yeah, that sounded like a pretty bizarre scene," The two of them in the cemetery, Deborah said thoughtfully. Her expression brightened. You know what? We should check them out. You mean go talk to them? Corky asked, following her toward the street. Deborah nodded. Yeah. Right now? Corky asked, glancing at her watch. It was nearly 10. Why not? Deborah asked. Well, Corky hesitated. That nice hot bath Kimmy had talked about sounded pretty good to her, too. Come on. We'll take my car, Deborah urged, pulling Corky by the arm. It'll only take a few minutes to drive to John Daly's house. Yeah, but what do we say when we get there? Corky asked. We can't just barge in and say, John, what were you and Sarah Beth Plummer doing in the cemetery the other night? Why not? Deborah said. She pulled open the back door to her car and dumped the candles and book on the seat. That's exactly what we'll ask. She tossed back her hood and brushed her sleek short hair with one hand. Come on, Corky. Get in. Corky hesitated for a long moment, then pulled open the passenger door and climbed in. Deborah slid into the driver's seat and rested her hands on top of the steering wheel. The glow of the streetlight fell over Deborah's pale, slender hand, and Corky thought of Chip's hand, lying forlornly beside the power saw. She saw the hand, severed neatly at the wrist, and then the puddles of dark blood, and then Chip lying face down in his own blood. Corky, what's the matter? Deborah cried, seeing Corky's horror-filled expression. Corky shut her eyes tight, erasing the picture. Let's go see John Daly, Corky said, her voice a dry whisper. The Dalys lived in the wealthy section of Shadyside known as North Hills, a few blocks from the high school. Deborah pulled up the driveway to the house, a sprawling redwood ranch-style house behind a neatly trimmed front lawn. At the end of the drive, the garage door was open. A Volvo station wagon was parked inside. 2 bikes hung on the wall. Corky wondered if one of them had belonged to Jennifer. So much death, she thought, climbing out of the car. The evil has claimed so many victims. She and Deborah walked side by side up the flagstone walk to the front door. Deborah raised her finger to the doorbell, then hesitated. Go ahead, Corky urged. We're here. We might as well talk to John. Deborah rang. They heard voices inside the house, then approaching footsteps. The porch light went on. The front door was pulled open. Miss Daly's head appeared in a rectangle of yellow light, her expression quickly turning to surprise. Why, hello, girls. Her faded blonde hair was wrapped in a red bandana. Her features seemed to melt together in the harsh light. Hi, Miss Daly, Corky said, clearing her throat. Remember me? I'm Bobby's sister. Of course, Miss Daly replied, eyeing Deborah. We came to see John, Corky said. Miss Daly's mouth dropped open.
Who is it?
Mr. Daly's voice floated out from the living room. Do you have any news about John? Miss Daly asked Corky, ignoring her husband's question. Huh? Corky couldn't hide her confusion. News?
Who is it?
Mr. Daly said again as he appeared behind his wife. He was tall and balding. He had on a Chicago Cubs t-shirt and straight-leg corduroys. His forehead was furrowed. The house smelled of stale cigarette smoke. They have news about John, Miss Daly told her husband. She gripped his hand. No, Corky corrected. We came to see John. We need to talk to him, Deborah added, self-consciously adjusting her cape. Oh. Miss Daly's face fell. The light faded from her eyes. John isn't here, Mr. Daly said sternly. We're worried sick about him, Miss Daly added, gripping her husband's hand. It's been 2 days. 2 days. We called the police. Huh? The police? Corky glanced at Deborah, who looked as startled as she did. Mr. Daly nodded sadly. Yes, John disappeared 2 days ago. We don't know what happened to him. Chapter 17. Fear. After dinner the next night, Corky waited for Deborah at Alma's, the small coffee shop where she and Chip had talked to Sarah Beth Plummer. The restaurant was bustling now, the booths and long counter filled with college students, laughing and talking, their voices competing with the clatter of silverware and china and the saxophone of a salsa band pouring out from the jukebox. Deborah came hurrying in, 10 minutes late, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She was wearing several layers of sweaters over blue corduroys. Her eyes swept over the crowded restaurant until she located Corky in the next-to-last booth. After making her way past a white-uniformed waitress holding a tray of glasses over her head, Deborah slid into the booth across from Corky and sighed. "Sorry I'm late." "No problem," Corky told her, her hands encircling a white mug of hot chocolate. "Where's Kimmy?" "She's sick," Deborah announced. "Her mom says she has a temperature and everything. That's why she wasn't in school today." Corky's mouth dropped open in surprise. "Sick? Will she be okay for the game tomorrow night?" Deborah shrugged. "I hope so." The waitress appeared, pad in hand, and stared down impatiently at Deborah. "You need a menu?" Deborah shook her head. "Just a Coke, please." "Sarah Beth Plummer lives right across the street," Corky said after the waitress left. "She pointed out the house to Chip and me that night. We sat over there." She indicated the rear booth. "And she told us about Sarah Fear." Deborah glanced at the booth Corky had pointed to. It was now occupied by 4 girls having hamburgers and French fries. "You think this Sarah Beth will be helpful?" Corky sipped her hot chocolate. She made a face. It tasted powdery. It hadn't been stirred enough. "I just had the feeling that night that Sarah Beth knew a lot more than she was telling us. There was something suspicious about her, you know? Something devious." Deborah's Coke arrived. She picked up the straw and blew the paper covering at Corky. "This Sarah Beth Plummer, is she old?" Corky shook her head. She brushed a strand of blonde hair from her eyes. "No, she's young. Early 20s, I think." "What makes you think she'll talk to us?" Deborah asked. "I don't know," Corky replied. "But I think we have to try to talk to her. I mean, I saw her dancing over Sarah Fear's grave with John Daly, and now John has disappeared." "Do you think Sarah Beth knows where the evil spirit is?" Deborah asked, sipping the Coke. "I intend to ask her," Corky replied, and sighed. "This is a crazy conversation, isn't it? If anyone overheard us, they'd think we were nuts." "But we're not nuts," Deborah said quickly, gesturing with both hands, accidentally bumping her glass and spilling a small puddle of Coke onto the tabletop. "The evil is real. We know that." "I know," Corky agreed quietly. "Let's go see what Sarah Beth Plummer knows," Deborah said. Both girls slid out of the booth and, after paying, hurried out of the restaurant. There was no name over the doorbell, but Corky remembered the house. It was a narrow 2-story, semi-detached red brick structure, part of a row of small houses, most of them occupied by students from the nearby community college. The 2 girls hesitated on the small concrete front stoop, staring at the curtained window beside the door. Corky raised her finger to the doorbell, then lowered it. "What's the matter?" Deborah asked in a loud whisper. A car rolled by quickly, its headlights sending a wash of white light over them, fixing them in a bright spot. "I just keep picturing Sarah Beth dancing in the cemetery," Corky replied, with John leaning over Sarah Fear's grave. She gripped the sleeve of Deborah's sweater. "She could be dangerous, Deborah. I mean, she could be possessed by the evil." Corky shuddered. "We could be walking into our death." "We have to find out," Deborah said in a tense whisper. "We've got to know the truth." Taking a deep breath, she reached forward and pressed the doorbell, leaving her finger on it for a long time. They could hear the buzzer inside the house. A light went on. They heard soft footsteps. Then the door was pulled open. Sarah Beth Plummer poked her head out. She had a bath towel wrapped around her hair. She must have just washed it, Corky realized. Sarah Beth's eyes fell on Deborah first. Then she recognized Corky. "Oh, hi." Her expression was a mixture of surprise and confusion. "Hi, remember me?" Corky asked meekly. "Yes, you're Corky," Sarah Beth said after some hesitation. "This is my friend, Deborah Kern," Corky said. Come in," Sarah Beth said, shivering. "It's freezing out, and I just shampooed my hair." The two girls followed her into a small living room filled with antique furniture. Corky carefully closed the front door behind her. The room was hot and smelled of oranges. 2 old oversized armchairs and a large plum-colored couch nearly filled the space. A low coffee table in front of the couch was stacked high with books, papers, and files. The walls were lined with crowded bookshelves that reached nearly to the ceiling. Sarah Beth rewrapped the towel on her head, staring at the two girls. She was wearing an oversized man's white shirt over black leggings and woolly white tube socks. "Can we talk with you?" Corky asked awkwardly. "I mean, is this a bad time or anything?" "No, I guess not," Sarah Beth replied, her expression still confused. "I was just making some coffee. Would you care for some?" "No, thanks," Deborah answered quickly. "Take off your coat," Sarah Beth told Corky. "You can just toss it over there." She pointed to one of the armchairs. "I thought, well, maybe you could tell us more about Sarah Fear," Corky stammered, obediently tossing her coat onto the back of one of the big chairs. Sarah Beth's mouth formed an O of surprise. "If it isn't too much trouble," Corky added. "Sarah Fear?" Sarah Beth said, eyeing both girls thoughtfully. "Well, it would really mean a lot to us," Deborah said. "Anything you know about her." "Okay," Sarah Beth reluctantly agreed. "I mean, I don't know that much, but sit down." She gestured to the couch. "I'll just go turn off the stove, then we can talk. I'll tell you what little I know." "Thanks a lot," Corky replied gratefully. "I know we're barging in." "No problem," Sarah Beth said, waving to them to sit. She hurried to the kitchen. "She has such an old lady's voice," Deborah whispered. "Yeah, I know," Corky whispered back. "She looked surprised to see us, but not that surprised," she added, her eyes on the doorway to the kitchen. "She didn't even ask us why we want to know about Sarah Fear," Deborah whispered. Deborah edged past the armchairs and sat down on the edge of the couch, sinking into the plush cushion. Corky tried to make her way to the other side of the couch, but she accidentally bumped the coffee table with her leg, sending a tall stack of files toppling to the carpet. "Nice move, Ace," Deborah joked. She tried to get up to help Corky pick up the files, but the low, soft cushion made it difficult for her to stand. Corky dropped to her knees and began hurriedly to pile the manila files back on the table. A bunch of envelopes fell out of one of the folders. She scooped them up and started to replace them, and then stopped. Her eyes widened in surprise. "Deborah, look!" she gasped. "What is it?" Deborah asked. "These envelopes," Corky said, her voice trembling. "They're all addressed to Sarah Fear." Chapter 18. Sunk. Sarah Fear? Deborah grabbed an envelope from Corky's hand and pulled it close to study it. "But this letter was postmarked only a few weeks ago," she exclaimed. Corky glanced nervously to the doorway. "Do you think Sarah Beth Plummer is really Sarah Fear?" she whispered, frantically stuffing the envelopes back into the folder. "You mean, is she over 100? Deborah asked. "The furniture is all so old," Corky remarked. "Sarah Fear would feel comfortable in this room." "I'm back." Sarah Beth reappeared, carrying a cup of steaming coffee. She stopped just past the doorway. Corky, what are you doing down there? I accidentally knocked some stuff over, Corky confessed, staring hard at Sarah Beth. Oh, don't worry about it, Sarah Beth said, moving toward one of the armchairs. This place is a mess. I'll pick it all up later. Sarah Beth? Corky started. She held up one of the envelopes. I couldn't help but see these letters. They're all addressed to Sarah Fear. Sarah Beth's eyes narrowed for a brief second, but she quickly resumed her friendly expression. I know, she told Corky. But Sarah Beth lowered herself carefully into the big armchair, sinking deep into the cushion, resting the coffee cup on the padded arm. She sighed. Well, I guess you know my secret. I'm a fear. Corky gasped. Sarah Beth laughed. It isn't that terrible. It doesn't mean I'm some kind of demon, you know. She seemed to find Corky's reaction very amusing. Corky climbed to her feet and joined Deborah on the couch. So your real name is Sarah Fear? She asked, staring into Sarah Beth's eyes as if trying to read her mind. Sarah Beth nodded. I don't use it. Most of the time I use my mother's maiden name, Plummer. She took a sip of coffee. The Fear name is such a curse. What do you mean? Corky asked, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. Your reaction said it best, Sarah Beth replied, smiling. When I said I was a fear, you practically fainted on the floor. All three of them laughed. I was just surprised, Corky explained. Surprised and horrified, Sarah Beth added. Everyone in Shadyside knows that the Fear family is filled with weirdos and monsters. The name is a curse. All the amusement drained from her face. She took a long sip of coffee. A curse. Are you related to the first Sarah Fear? Deborah asked. Are you named after her? I'm related to her somehow, Beth replied. I don't know if my parents named me after her or not. I don't think so. She reached up with her free hand and pulled the towel off her head. Her black hair, still wet, fell down around her face. She tossed the towel over the chair. I've spent my whole life trying to get away from that dreadful name, she said with emotion. Fear. She made a disgusted face. But it's funny. I find myself drawn to the story of the fears. I'm fascinated by my ancestors, drawn to them, pulled to them as if by an invisible force. When we talked the last time, Corky started, across the street at the restaurant, I didn't tell you everything, Sarah Beth interrupted. I confess. Her dark eyes burned into Corky's. I didn't reveal everything I know about Sarah Fear. I just didn't want to. She paused, and then her expression hardened, and she added, I really don't want to now. Corky recoiled at the young woman's sudden coldness. She glanced at Deborah, who was staring intently at Sarah Beth. We really need your help, Corky said, her voice cracking with emotion. My sister and my friends, Bobby and Chip and Jennifer, they've all lost their lives. And I don't know, maybe I'm next. Surprise registered on Sarah Beth's face. She set her cup down on the carpet at her feet. Something evil killed Bobby and Chip, Corky continued. Something evil from beyond this world. And we think it has something to do with Sarah Fear. That's why we have to find out all we can about Sarah Fear, Deborah said, shifting her weight on the couch. We need to know everything you know so that maybe we can stop this evil. Sarah Beth stared at Deborah, as if seeing her for the first time. I don't understand, she said finally. I really don't think my dredging up ancient history will do you any good. Please, Corky cried, not intending to sound so shrill, so desperate. Please, Sarah Beth, please help us. Please tell us what you know. Sarah Beth raised both hands as if surrendering at gunpoint. Okay, I'll talk, she cried. Don't shoot. First, tell us what you and John Daly were doing in the cemetery the other night, Corky said. The words just burst out of her. She hadn't really intended to ask that question till later. Sarah Beth acted surprise. You were there? She asked Corky. In the cemetery? No, just driving by, Corky explained. Sarah Beth blushed. She took a deep breath. I didn't think anyone saw us. She stared at Corky. She's stalling, Corky thought. She's thinking fast, trying to think of a good lie. I saw you dance, Corky said, staring back at Sarah Beth, challenging her with her eyes. Sarah Beth chuckled and shook her head. It was all so silly. Silly? Corky asked. She was determined not to let Sarah Beth off the hook. I've known John for years, Sarah Beth said, her cheeks still pink. We were in school together. We even dated for a while. But I lost touch with him. When he called me a few weeks ago, I was really surprised. He called you? Corky asked. Sarah Beth picked up the coffee cup and took a long sip. Yeah, out of the blue. He was really pumped, sounded a little crazy to me, but John was never exactly what you'd call calm. What did he want? Deborah asked, tucking her legs under her. He wanted me to meet him in the Fear Street Cemetery, Sarah Beth replied, reaching up and fluffing her still damp hair. John knows that I'm a fear, and he knows about my interest in my ancestors and my interest in spirits and the occult. She finished her coffee and set the cup back down on the carpet. So I met him at the cemetery, she continued. He was definitely acting weird. I mean, really weird, even for John. As soon as I got there, he started asking me if I knew the truth about his sister, Jennifer. I really didn't know what he was talking about. Corky stared intently at Sarah Beth, listening, studying her eyes. I don't think she's telling us the truth, Corky thought. There's something wrong with the story. Then John started asking me if I believed in evil spirits. I told him I believed in all kinds of things, but that didn't seem to satisfy him. He knew I studied the occult and the spirit world. He asked me if I knew how to summon spirits from the grave. At first, I just laughed at him. I thought he was kidding me. She shook her wet hair. Are you two okay? Do you think it's too warm in here? I could turn down the heat. No, we're fine, Deborah replied quickly. Please, go on. Well, I didn't really want to continue. But John was so insistent. He was really out of his head. I told him I'd read about a dance you do on someone's grave to summon the dead person's spirit. He demanded that I show it to him. I felt ridiculous, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. So I showed him a little bit of the dance. I mean, actually I made up most of it. I don't really know it. She turned to Corky. I guess that's when you drove by. But you seemed to be really into it, Corky thought skeptically. You didn't act like it was some kind of goof, Sarah Beth. You looked really serious to me." "Then what happened?" Corky asked.
Nothing,
Sarah Beth replied with a shrug.
nothing happened. No spirit appeared. Big surprise, huh? I thought Jon would be disappointed, but he looked very pleased. Really happy for some reason. Then we said good night and went our separate ways. I haven't seen or heard from him since.
Something's wrong here, Corky thought. There's something wrong with this story.
What a strange guy,
Sarah Beth said thoughtfully.
He's scary, I think. Really scary.
The room grew silent. A clock somewhere in the back started to chime. Corky glanced at her watch. 9 o'clock.
Sure I can't get you some coffee? Sarah Beth offered. It's all made.
No thanks, the two girls said, again in unison.
Then I guess I'll tell you about Sarah Fear,
Sarah Beth said, stifling a yawn.
That's why you've come, right?
Yes, we really need to know about her, Corky said, studying Sarah Beth's face.
I'm afraid you'll be disappointed,
Sarah Beth told them.
I don't know all that much. Most of it I got from old newspapers and what few family records I could find. One of Sarah's cousins, Ben Fear, kept a journal. That was helpful up to a point. But believe me, there are a lot of gaps in the story. A lot of gaps.
She tucked her legs beneath her in the big chair, leaned on one of the overstuffed arms, and began to talk, moving her eyes from Corky to Deborah, then staring down at the dark carpet as she spoke. I guess I'll begin with Sarah Fear's death. Or, I should say, near death. That would be in, 1899, I guess. Up to that point, I think you could say that Sarah had managed to escape the curse of the Fears, meaning she had had a fairly happy life. In his journal, Ben Fear described her as a lovely flower of a young woman. That's the way Ben wrote. He was pretty flowery himself. But I guess it can be said that Sarah was beautiful in every way. She was a lovely young woman, kind, generous, and loving. I'm starting to sound like Ben Fear, Sarah Beth muttered, rolling her eyes. Oh, well, bear with me. According to family records, Sarah was happily married, for a brief time anyway. She never had any children. She and her husband lived close to Simon Fear's mansion. Their house was always filled with people, cousins, friends, servants. It was quite a life, and it didn't change much, even after Sarah's husband died of pneumonia. She mourned him for an entire year. Then she resumed her busy, people-filled life. Then, in early 1899, the good life abruptly came to an end. Poor Sarah fell ill, deathly ill. I don't really know what the sickness was. Perhaps no one back then knew either. In his journal, Ben Fear described it as a wasting disease. Old Ben had a way with words, didn't he? Well, the doctors gave up on Sarah. She was given up for dead. In fact, a grave was dug in preparation in the Fear Street Cemetery. And a minister was called upon and told to prepare a funeral ceremony. But then there was some kind of miracle. To everyone's surprise, Sarah Fear didn't die. In fact, she made a remarkably fast recovery. Her strength seemed to return overnight. And despite the pleas of her family, to rest and regain her energy, she pulled herself out of bed the very next day and returned to her duties of running the house. Here's where the story gets strange. After her illness, Sarah changed. She wasn't the same sweet flower anymore. According to Ben Fear's journal, she became withdrawn, reclusive.
She developed a terrible temper and was known to throw tantrums for no apparent reason. She turned away from all of her friends. The details in the diary become sketchier and sketchier towards the end of her life. My theory is that Ben Fear was no longer invited to Sarah's house, and so he had little first-hand information about her to write in his journal. He did tell of rumors that Sarah and a servant had become lovers. There were reports of strange gatherings in her house, late-night meetings, seances, wild parties. The police reports are very discreet. Don't forget, Simon Fear was still around, still a powerful figure in the town. Nevertheless, the scandalous story about Sarah began to spread. The newspaper became full of frightening stories about the events that took place at Sarah's house. One spring day, a kitchen maid was found murdered in the garden, stabbed through the heart with an enormous pair of head shears. A house guest was also murdered, his leg severed, cleanly cut off his body, and found lying beside him on the floor of the stable. Sarah Fear was never under suspicion for these murders, and the mysteries were never solved. Then came the biggest and most tragic mystery of them all, the pleasure boat trip. Sarah Fear's final trip. It took place on Fear Lake, tranquil, flat Fear Lake, the tiny, round lake behind the Fear Street woods. There were 5 people on the boat, Sarah Fear, 3 of her relatives, and 1 servant. According to the newspaper report, it was a beautiful summer day, a perfect day, no clouds, no wind. Sarah's large pleasure boat sailed away from the shore, and a few minutes later it happened. Out of nowhere, a mysterious hurricane-force gale, totally unexpected, on the calmest, most beautiful day of the summer. A wind so powerful that it capsized the large boat, turned it over in a flash, and everyone drowned. Everyone, including Sarah Fear. Within view of shore, only a 5 or 10 minute swim at most. And yet all on board Sarah's boat were drowned. There were no survivors. Which brings us to the strangest part of all, Sarah Beth said, leaning forward in her big chair, staring at the 2 girls across from her on the couch, lowering her voice to just above a whisper. The strangest part of all, when the bodies were pulled ashore, their skin was bright red, blistered, and scalding hot, as if Sarah and her companions had all drowned in boiling water.
Chapter 19. Did you hear about John? Drive around, Corky said. I don't feel like going in just yet. Let's park and talk, Deborah said. She pulled the car halfway up Corky's driveway and cut the lights and the engine. Corky turned her eyes to the house. The lamp over the door cast a yellow triangle of light on the front porch. All the other lights were out. Her parents were either in the back or had gone to bed early. Did you get the feeling that Sarah Beth was holding something back? Deborah asked, tapping her gloved hands on the steering wheel. Corky slid down low in the passenger seat, raising her knees to the dashboard. Yeah, I think she knows more than she let on, she agreed. But I don't know what it would be. I asked her if she thought Sarah Fear had been possessed by an evil spirit, Deborah said. She just looked at me as if I were from Mars or something. She wouldn't answer any of my questions either, Corky complained. You heard me when I asked what happened to the servant who was supposed to be her lover. And all she would say was that Sarah Fear's secrets were buried with her. Deborah sighed and rubbed her glove against the side window, which was starting to steam up. weird lady," she said quietly. They had left Sarah Beth's house a little after 10 o'clock, their heads spinning with the bizarre details of the story she had related to them.
"I hope I've been helpful,"
Sarah Beth had said as she walked them to the door.
"If I come across anything else, I'll get in touch with you."
But Corky and Deborah left with more doubts and suspicions than when they had arrived. They had driven the short distance back to Corky's house in silence, each going over in her mind what she had heard. And now they sat in Corky's driveway as the car windows steamed up around them, eager to share their thoughts. "It's just too perfect," Deborah said, squeezing the steering wheel with both hands. "She's telling us about Sarah Fear, and her name is Sarah Fear. It's too perfect and too strange." "They died in scalding hot water," Corky said thoughtfully, closing her eyes. "That's how my sister died, in the shower, in scalding hot water." "I know," Deborah said in a whisper, staring straight ahead. "And remember the tea kettle, that afternoon when I scalded my hand?" Corky cried, her mouth dropping open in horror as the memory flew back to her. "Again, scalding hot water." "I remember," Deborah said, putting a hand on Corky's trembling shoulder. "You're right. Hot water is a clue. It's definitely a clue." "But a clue to what?" Corky asked shrilly, feeling her frustration build. "A clue to what?" "What about those gross murders at Sarah Fear's house?" Deborah asked, turning in her seat to face Corky. "The house guest with his leg cut clean off. Just like Chip. Just like Chip's hand." Corky swallowed hard. I hadn't thought about that, Deb, but you're right." The two girls sat silent for a long moment, staring at the steamed-up windshield. "So, what are we proving?" Deborah asked finally. "Well," Corky thought hard, "I guess we're proving that it's the same evil spirit doing the same horrible things, then and now." "And how does that help us?" Deborah demanded, staring intently at Corky. Corky shrugged. "I don't know." She shook her head unhappily. "I just don't." "There has to be another clue in the Sarah Fear story," Deborah insisted, her features tight with concentration. "There has to be a clue about how to defeat the evil spirit. Somehow the spirit ended up in Sarah Fear's grave. We know that. Somehow it was forced to stay down there for 100 years. But how? How did Sarah Fear defeat it?" "She didn't," Corky said dryly. "She didn't defeat it. It killed Sarah Fear. Remember?" "Oh, yeah," Deborah said softly. They lapsed into silence again. "Now, 100 years later, more death," Corky said, staring at the clouded windshield. "Jennifer, Bobby, Chip." A loud sob escaped her throat. "I wonder who'll be next," Deborah muttered, her eyes dark with fear. Corky's parents were watching TV in the den and back. Pulling off her coat, she went in to say hi to them. They were engrossed in some cop show, and she could see they didn't want to chat, so Corky said goodnight and headed up to her room. She didn't feel like talking to anyone. Her head felt as if it weighed 1,000 pounds, weighed down by all she had heard and by her confused thoughts and theories. If only she could trust Sarah Beth Plummer, she thought, starting to pull off her clothes and get ready for bed. But I know we can't trust her. For all we know, Sarah Beth herself could be the evil spirit. If only we could trust somebody. She pulled on a long nightshirt and deposited her clothes in a neat pile on the chair across from her bed. Deborah and Kimmy and I, we're all alone, Corky thought. We're all alone against this ancient evil force. We're the only ones who know about it, the only ones who believe in it. And what can the three of us do? What? I don't know. she told herself, heading to the bathroom across the hall to brush her teeth. We shouldn't have gone to Sarah Beth's. Now I'm even more confused than before, and more frightened. She had just started to put toothpaste on the brush when she heard her phone ringing. Dropping the toothbrush into the sink, she dashed back into her room and picked up the receiver. Hello?
Hi, Corky. It's Kimmy.
Kimmy! Corky cried in surprise. Hey, how are you feeling?
Better, I guess.
Kimmy replied uncertainly.
My temperature is down. But I didn't call about that.
She sounded breathless, excited. What's happening? Corky said.
Did you hear about John Daly?
Kimmy asked, nearly squeaking the words. What about John? Corky demanded. Did they find him?
Yeah, they found him all right.
Kimmy replied.
They found him in Fear Lake, drowned.
Chapter 20. A Cheerleader Falls.
How do you feel?
Kimmy asked. Kind of fluttery, Corky told her, swallowing hard. Kimmy took the maroon and white pom-pom from Corky's hand and helped her untangle it.
You'll do fine,
she said, flashing Corky an encouraging smile as she handed it back.
Once the game starts, you won't even think about how nervous you are.
I hope she's right, Corky thought, glancing up at the scoreboard, which was being set up for the game. The scoreboard lights were all flashing, and the clock was going haywire, the numbers running backward faster than Corky could read them. I hope the game goes that quickly, Corky thought. Fiddling with the cuffs of her white sweater, she could feel her heart racing. She took a deep breath and tried to calm herself. A few early arrivals entered the gym and made their way to the bleachers. Corky watched them, then turned her eyes back to the scoreboard clock. About half an hour until game time. A hand touched her shoulder. She jumped, startled.
Sorry, Miss Green said. I just wondered if you needed a pep talk.
Corky grinned. Thanks, but I think I'll be okay.
Nervous?
The advisor asked, studying Corky's face. Corky nodded. Yeah, but I can handle it.
You'll be great,
Miss Green said, glancing at the gym door as more people entered.
Practice has been terrific. The new pyramid routine should tear the roof off.
If I don't fall on my face, Corky joked. Miss Green chuckled.
You'll get your old confidence back once the game starts. You'll see.
She gave Corky a thumbs up, turned, and jogged back toward Kimmy and the other cheerleaders. By now, the bleachers were nearly half full. The scoreboard clock showed 15 minutes till game time. The teams were warming up on opposite ends of the floor, shooting running layups, several balls thundering off the basket and backboard at once.
Showtime!
Kimmy called, clapping her hands, gathering the cheerleaders together. Corky moved quickly into the circle, wiping her perspiring hands on the sides of her short skirt.
Energy up!
Kimmy shouted.
Let's get this crowd warmed up! Let's see some spirit!
The girls all cheered. Deborah gave Corky an encouraging smile and a slap on the back. Forming a line, they trotted to the bleachers and began their warm-up chant.
Shady side high, shady side high, can you dig it? Everybody's here, so everybody cheer!
Then again, louder, encouraging the crowd to join in, to clap, to get loud. And again, even louder. And the crowd picked up the chant, picked up the enthusiasm, stomping and clapping until the nearly filled bleachers bounced and shook.
Let's get a little bit rowdy! R-O-W-D-Y!
And again. They repeated this chant until the Shady Side fans were screaming out the word. Then they ended it with synchronized back handsprings, all 6 girls performing a backward flip in unison, landing perfectly before jumping up and starting the chant again. It's going great, Corky thought, with relief as the shouts and cheers echoed off the walls. I'm going to be okay. She looked down the line of girls and saw Kimmy grinning back at her. I'm going to be okay, Corky thought. The game started. The gym reverberated with the pounding and squeaking of 10 pairs of basketball shoes and the steady thud of the ball against the shiny hardwood floor. Corky knelt on the sidelines with the rest of the squad, watching for a break when the cheerleaders would go into action. She could feel her heart racing, but from excitement rather than nervousness. The game was going quickly, a close match in which the lead kept changing sides. Corky watched intently and, when it came time to do a cheer, performed with her old enthusiasm and grace. Standing in front of the cheering fans, the crowd stretching up nearly to the rafters, she felt as if she were shouting away her problems, roaring back at all the terrors that had plagued her. Just before halftime, she turned to see Kimmy huddled behind her. She leaned down and spoke into Corky's ear, struggling to be heard over the thunderous crowd noise.
About the pyramid!
Kimmy shouted. Corky cupped her ear and smiled up at her.
At the end, when you're ready to dismount from the top, count to 3, okay? So I can be sure I'm in position to catch you.
Okay, gotcha!
Corky nodded.
Have I been coming down too fast?
I just want to make sure I'm in position,
Kimmy said, putting a hand on her shoulder.
So count to 3 and then jump, and I'll be there.
Thanks,
Corky said, and then she added,
I'm really grateful, Kimmy, for everything.
Kimmy didn't hear. She had moved on to give instructions to Ronnie and Heather. It was halftime before Corky realized it. The time did seem to be moving as fast as the scoreboard clock when it was being set before the game. The visiting cheerleading squad performed first. They had come with a 10-piece band and did a lot of rap cheers and club-type dancing. They're good, Corky heard Megan say as they waited on the sidelines. They're different, she heard Heather reply. She didn't mean it as a compliment. A few minutes later, Corky felt her excitement surge as she followed the other girls to the center of the floor to begin their performance. The opening routines went well. Then, Ronnie mistimed a backflip and landed hard. But Deborah helped her up quickly, and the routine continued without a pause. There were no other mishaps. We're doing okay, Corky thought happily. She suddenly wondered if her parents were somewhere up in the bleachers. They had talked about coming to the game and bringing Sean. I hope you're here, Corky thought. I hope you're seeing how great everything is going. My big comeback. And then it was time for the pyramid, the grand finale. As the girls began their shoulder mounts, the crowd hushed expectantly. Corky crossed her fingers for a brief second, took a deep breath, and began her climb. Up, up, and she was at the top, and the pyramid was formed. Perfect. And the crowd shouted its appreciation. Corky smiled and thrust out her arms, and as she focused on the top of the bleachers, the gym began to spin. The entire room began to twirl, like a carnival ride out of control. She uttered a low cry. She felt her knees start to buckle. What's happening? The walls were whirling. She was inside a spinning cyclone of light and color and noise. No! Please! Struggling to keep her balance, she closed her eyes. When she opened them, the gym was still whirling. Faces suddenly came clear as the bleachers spun around in front of her. She saw a red-haired boy with freckles. Saw him so clearly. The room spun around again. The whirling lights grew brighter, brighter. Swirls of red and yellow and white. And she saw a man with a red wool scarf tossed around his neck, sitting close to the floor. And the gym spun around again. The shouts and cries seemed to circle her, press in on her, suffocate her as the blindingly bright gym whirled faster and faster, and then stopped. And she saw Sarah Beth Plummer standing just inside the double doors. Sarah Beth Plummer? What was she doing here? I've got to get down, Corky thought, feeling cold perspiration run down her forehead, feeling her knees tremble. Got to get down. She turned her eyes to the floor, and there was Kimmy, ready for her, in position already, waiting, giving her an encouraging nod. Corky took a deep breath. Her legs felt rubbery, weak. She leaned forward, raised her knees, tucked her legs, and leapt. Kimmy's face twisted into a mask of horror. She didn't move to catch Corky, didn't raise her arms, and Corky hurtled to the floor, hitting hard with a sickening thunk. Chapter 21. Not Okay. Corky opened her eyes to silence. White silence. The gym had become so quiet. Faces emerged and came slowly into focus. Blurred, distorted, shadowy faces.
I couldn't move!
She heard a shrill voice crying somewhere above her.
I couldn't move! I couldn't raise my arms!
It was Kimmy's voice. The shadowy faces brightened. Corky realized she was lying on her back, staring up at the gym ceiling. The pain was like a raging river, rolling over her entire body. Miss Green peered down at her, her features tight with worry. Other faces stared down. Ronnie's face was drawn and pale. She had tear stains on her freckled cheeks. Deborah stared down at Corky, her cold blue eyes wide, her lips pursed in fear. She could hear Kimmy sobbing now, loud sobs. It was so cold now, so cold and silent, and the pain was everywhere.
I wanted to catch her,
she heard Kimmy tell someone, her voice shrill and trembling.
I tried to catch her, but something held my arms down.
That's what Bobby had said, Corky thought. The faces above her slipped back into darkness. That's what happened to my sister, she realized. Something had held Bobby's arms down. Something had paralyzed Bobby. Only no one would believe her. I believe you, Bobby. I believe you. Because I know what was responsible. I know what did it. It was the spirit. The evil spirit is here. It's right here. But where? It tried to kill me. It tried. And then the most horrifying thought, maybe it did kill me. The faces darkened even more. She heard Kimmy sobbing, and then the darkness swallowed her. When Corky opened her eyes, a different face stared down at her.
Mom!
Her voice came out choked and dry. Mrs. Corcoran, her eyes watery, smiled down at Corky. You're going to be okay, she said, putting a cool hand on her forehead. Corky tried to sit up, but pain forced her back onto the pillow. Where am I? You're in the hospital, her mother said. Her smile appeared frozen in place. It didn't fade, even when she talked. The emergency room. She dabbed at the corner of one eye with a wadded-up tissue. The room came into focus. Actually, Corky saw it wasn't a room, just a small rectangular cubicle with gray curtains for walls. You're going to be okay, Mrs. Corcoran repeated, still offering Corky that forced smile. No, I'm not, Corky thought glumly. You bruised a rib. You broke your arm. That's all, her mother informed her. So the spirit didn't kill me, Corky thought, turning to stare at the gray curtains. It didn't kill me, this time. But next time... Your father is filling out some forms, Miss Corcoran said. When he's finished, we can go home. Isn't that great? You're going to be okay. Corky forced a smile back at her mother. I'm not going to be okay, she thought. I'm never going to be okay. The evil spirit had killed Bobby, and tonight it was in the gym. Tonight it tried to kill me. I'm not okay. Not okay. Not okay. A dark-haired young intern in a white coat appeared suddenly above her. Can you sit up? He asked, smiling. I'd like to check the cast one more time. Holding her by the shoulder, he helped Corky to a sitting position. To her surprise, she saw a large white cast encasing her right arm. I wouldn't try to do any backflips for a while, the doctor joked. Sean, what are you doing up this late? Mrs. Corcoran scolded. Corky's brother, who had greeted them eagerly at the front door in his pajamas, shrugged his slender shoulders. He refused to go to bed, explained Mrs. Barnaby, the neighbor who had been babysitting. He said he had to see his sister's cast. Well, back away from the door so your poor sister can get inside, Mr. Corcoran exclaimed. Sean's eyes grew wide with excitement when he saw Corky's cast.
Wow! Can I touch it?
Corky extended it to him. Go ahead, if that's a thrill for you.
No, wait!
Sean said excitedly.
I want to sign my name on it. You're supposed to sign casts, right?
Not tonight, please, their mother begged. Corky's had a rough night, Mr. Corcoran told Sean. Give her some space.
Can I write a message on it?
Sean asked, ignoring his parents as usual.
You know, something funny?
Tomorrow, Corky said shakily. I'm really feeling kind of weird right now. Sean made his pouty face, but backed off. You got 2 calls, Mrs. Barnaby told Corky, pulling her wool coat over her shoulders, adjusting her scarf. I wrote them down. 1 from Deborah, 1 from Ronnie's someone. I told them you were still at the hospital. Thanks, Corky said wearily. I'll call them tomorrow. Mrs. Barnaby said good night and headed for home. Sean argued for a short while, then he agreed to let Mr. Corcoran tuck him into bed. Tomorrow, I'm going to write something really stupid on your cast, he warned Corky. Thanks. Can't wait, his sister replied dryly. I'm going to run you a hot bath, Mrs. Corcoran told Corky. The doctor said it would be good for your sore muscles. Corky shrugged. Okay, I guess. I've been attacked by an ancient evil force, she thought scornfully, and Mom thinks a bath will help. You just have to be careful not to get the cast wet, her mother warned. I'll try, Corky muttered. She followed her mother up the stairs. After entering her room, she lowered herself carefully into a sitting position on the edge of the bed. Her ribs ached. Her arm throbbed under the cast. I can't do anything, she thought, uttering an exasperated cry. I can't even undress myself. She heard the rush of water in the bathtub across the hall. A few seconds later, her mother appeared in the doorway, shaking water off her hand. Let me help you change. Corky felt embarrassed to be undressed by her mother, but she was too weary to protest. Her mother slipped a cotton robe around Corky, then helped her tie the belt. This isn't going to be easy, she told her daughter, but we'll manage. Corky sighed in response and started toward the bathroom. Do you want me to help you get in the tub? Mrs. Corcoran called after her. You've got to be very careful. No, thanks, I'll manage, Corky said. She stepped into the bathroom and closed the door behind her. The room was steamy and warm. The steam felt good against her cheeks. She bent and turned off the water with her left hand. Just call me Lefty, she said aloud. She stared down into the deep aqua tub. The bath looked inviting. Every muscle in her body ached. This is going to feel good, she thought. She had started to pull off the robe when she realized that someone was standing behind her. She turned quickly. First, she saw the maroon and white cheerleader outfit. Then, she saw the girl's face. "Kimmy!" Corky cried in surprise. "What are you doing here?" Chapter 22. Corky's Bath. The white steam rose up around Kimmy. Her dark eyes glowed in the misty light.
I wanted to get rid of you forever,
she said coldly, speaking in a low, husky voice. Corky backed up against the closed bathroom door. "Kimmy, what? What are you saying? You're frightening me." Kimmy's normal pink cheeks flushed scarlet.
I'm not Kimmy,
she announced in the strange, husky voice. "Kimmy, listen," Corky started. Her ribs ached. Pain throbbed down her arm. "I'm so tired.
You didn't cooperate,
Kimmy said, taking a step toward Corky.
You were supposed to die like your sister.
"Now, wait!" Corky cried. "Kimmy!"
I'm not Kimmy,
she snarled, then let out a roar that blew away all the steam.
I am what you fear most.
"No!" Corky tried to shriek, raising her good hand to fend off the menacing figure before her. The puzzle is solved, she realized, feeling paralyzed by dread, unable to move, to call for help, to take her eyes off the advancing girl. The puzzle is solved. The evil spirit is revealed. It's been inside Kimmy. "Where is Kimmy?" Corky demanded, finding her voice. "What have you done with Kimmy? Did you kill her?" At first, the creature didn't respond. Her dark eyes reddened, then glowed like fire. Her hair, Kimmy's black hair, rose up around her head, flew up like dark flames. The low, raspy voice declared,
I have been in Kimmy ever since that night in the cemetery, the night you thought you sent me back to my grave.
Corky stared in silent horror into the creature's eyes, glowing like coals on a fire, at the dark hair flying wildly around its face.
You thought you were defeating me,
the evil spirit continued.
You should have known better. Ronnie was there too, and Deborah was there, and Kimmy. Lucky Kimmy.
You moved from Jennifer's body to Kimmy's, Corky whispered, slumping weakly back against the door. Kimmy's eyes grew even brighter, so bright Corky had to look away. "Why?" Corky asked. "Why are you doing this? Why did you kill Chip and Jon? Why are you trying to kill me?"
Kimmy's enemies became my enemies,
the voice rasped.
I paid Chip back for dumping Kimmy and for liking you. Jon was following me everywhere. He was coming too close to the truth. I knew that when I saw him with Sarah Beth.
She paused, her dark eyes narrowed icily.
He's gone now.
"But why kill me?" Corky cried in a shrill, frightened voice she didn't recognize.
I have to pay you back for that night in the cemetery. You tried to destroy me. Now you must be destroyed.
"No!" Corky cried. She reached for the doorknob, but the door wouldn't budge.
Time for your bath,
the husky voice said.
So nice of you to draw a hot, steamy bath. Now, Corky dear, you can die like your sister.
With startling strength, Kimmy grabbed Corky by the hair, jerked her toward the tub, and started to force her head down into the hot water. Chapter 23. Down the Drain. "Oh!" Corky tried to pull back as Kimmy pushed her head down toward the steaming tub, but Kimmy was too powerful. The steaming water seemed to rise up to meet Corky. I'm going to drown, she thought. I'm going to die now. She closed her eyes as her face met the water. So hot. So burning hot. She held her breath, twisted her body, tried to force her head up. Kimmy pushed with inhuman strength. Deeper. Corky felt the water fill her ears, rise up over her hair. I'm drowning now. I'm dead. Pictures whirled wildly through her mind. Faces of all her friends, people she didn't recognize. Her chest ached. I can't hold my breath much longer. My lungs are going to explode. More pictures raced through her mind. A jumble of faces. She saw her family. She saw Sean. Sad-faced Sean. Now he won't get to sign my cast, she thought. He'll wake up and I'll be dead. Dead, dead, dead. And Sean will be alone. No! A voice screamed in her head. No! I can't let this happen! I can't let the evil win again! As her fear turned to anger, and her anger flamed to desperate rage, Corky reared up against the powerful force with all her strength and swung the heavy cast. Oh! Kimmy groaned as the elbow of the cast clubbed the back of her head. Momentarily stunned, her fiery eyes faded to black. She stumbled forward. And as she stumbled, Corky stood up, water pouring off her head. She grabbed Kimmy's wildly flying black hair with her left hand, jerked the head downward with all her might, and pushed Kimmy's face into the steaming hot water. Corky turned, and still grasping Kimmy's hair with her good hand, leaned the cast on Kimmy's head and pushed. Down. Down. Kimmy's head was entirely submerged. She struggled to get up. Her arms flailed frantically. She kicked with her legs. She strained to raise her head. Her chest heaving, the pain shooting through her body, Corky leaned all of her weight against Kimmy's head, pushing it down, bearing down with the heavy cast. Kimmy thrashed and fought. She pushed up with inhuman strength, pushed up, strained against Corky's cast, struggling to remove her head from the water. Drown! Drown! Corky said without even realizing it. Drown! Drown! And then Kimmy's mouth opened wide. A raging wind poured from her mouth into the water. A wind so hot, so fierce, the water instantly began to boil and bubble. And still Corky pressed down, battling the force, and pushed Kimmy's head back down, submerging it so the raging wind made boiling tidal waves roll across the tub. The tiny room filled with steam. Thick, white clouds of it rose up from the tub, scalding hot. Corky began to choke on it. I can't see, she realized. It's thicker than any fog. She couldn't see her own arm, couldn't see the cast, could no longer see the head she was holding under the water. The white steam grew even thicker. Corky blindly choked, gasping for air, and hung on to the struggling head as the wind raged and the bathwater tossed and churned. Hung on blindly. I'm suffocating, she thought. I can't breathe. I'm drowning in a cloud, drowning in a thick, scalding cloud. Suffocating. Like Bobby. But she held on and pushed with her remaining strength, pushed in spite of her pain, pressed the head under the rolling hot water. The steam cleared. Corky could see again. Under the water, Kimmy uttered a loud groan. A disgusting green liquid poured from her mouth. The stench of it rose up from the tossing water. Corky gagged, struggling to hold her breath, trying not to breathe. The thick green liquid oozed out of Kimmy's mouth, took shape, formed a long, snake-like figure. Longer. It coiled around the bottom of the tub. More. More rolled out of Kimmy's open mouth.
Drown! 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 Please! Drown!
Corky screamed. Leaning on Kimmy's head with the cast, she reached down and pulled open the drain. She heard a gurgling sound and stared in disbelief as the foul-smelling green liquid snake was sucked down the drain. Chapter 24. The End? As it oozed down the drain, the thick green liquid made a disgusting sucking sound that grew louder and louder, echoing in Corky's head, vibrating until the walls appeared to shake. Still holding Kimmy's head down even though the water had been drained, Corky held her breath, trying to avoid the putrid odor that invaded her nostrils. The white steam rising from the tub rolled over her, wrapped her up like a hot, wet blanket. The last of the undulating green gunk gurgled into the drain. Corky shut her eyes. When she opened them, the steam had vanished. The room was clear. Silence. She stared down into the tub. The green ooze was gone. The water had drained out. Kimmy uttered a low cry. With a sob of relief, Corky loosened her grip on Kimmy's head.
Hey!
Kimmy cried in her old voice, not the frightening, raspy voice of the evil spirit.
Hey!
Bent over the empty tub, Kimmy shook her head, beads of water rolling off her black curls. Reluctantly, Corky let go of Kimmy's head and backed away from the tub. Her arm throbbing under the heavy cast, her entire body aching. Kimmy turned around slowly, her dark eyes wide with confusion. She pushed herself up from the tub and stood breathing hard, her chest heaving. She stared at Corky as if she didn't recognize her.
Corky?
She cried uncertainly, squinting, her mouth dropping open. Her eyes darted around the small room.
Where am I? What am I doing here?
Despite her weariness, Corky let out a whoop of joy. Kimmy, is it you? The question seemed to confuse Kimmy even more. Corky offered her a hand. Kimmy, I don't believe it! She helped pull Kimmy to her feet. Kimmy gripped the sink to steady herself.
But how? I mean, I don't understand.
She suddenly reached up and grabbed her hair with both hands.
I'm wet! I don't...
Take it easy, Corky said softly. Let's get out of here. Let's go downstairs and...
But how did I get here?
Kimmy demanded.
I was in the Fear Street Cemetery. You were struggling, wrestling with Jennifer over that open grave.
That's the last thing you remember? Corky exclaimed. Kimmy, that was months ago.
Huh?
Still gripping her hair tightly in both hands, Kimmy gaped at Corky.
Months? What do you mean?
Corky started to reply, but a loud pounding on the bathroom door made her stop.
Corky, are you okay?
Her mother called in.
What's going on in there?
Corky pulled open the door. Mom, it's okay. Mrs. Corcoran gasped in shock. Kimmy, what are you doing here?
I don't know,
Kimmy told her, still dazed. Kimmy's okay, Corky told her mother. She's okay. Let's get her downstairs. But she's all wet, Mrs. Corcoran cried in confusion. And so are you. Corky managed to calm her mother. They helped Kimmy down the stairs and onto the living room couch. Mrs. Corcoran went into the kitchen to call Kimmy's parents to come and get her. When her mother was out of the room, Corky moved next to Kimmy on the couch and whispered to her, "The evil. It's gone." Kimmy started to say something, but Corky put a hand on her arm to silence her. "Just listen to me. The evil is gone. I drowned it. Really, I drowned it. I saw it disappear this time. Maybe now the nightmare is over. Maybe it really is gone for good. A few hours later, Corky lay awake in bed, watching the shadows play across her ceiling. Her ribs ached. Her arm throbbed and itched under the cast. She shifted her weight uncomfortably. Poor Kimmy, she thought. She was so dazed, so confused. I don't think she'll ever believe the truth. Corky tried to turn onto her side, but a stab of pain shot across her chest. She rolled onto her back again, tugging the covers with her good hand. Is the evil spirit really gone forever? She wondered, closing her eyes. Will my life finally return to normal? Yes. She answered her own question. Yes, yes, yes. Happily repeating the word over and over, she fell into a fitful sleep. The next morning, she slept late. The clock radio on her night table said 11:55 when she pulled herself out of bed, yawned, and stretched her one good hand. She stood up, feeling stronger, a little unsteady, but definitely stronger. She looked out the window. Bright blue skies. A sunny day, she thought, smiling. At last, a sunny day. The days will all be sunny from now on, she thought, cheerfully. She smiled at herself in her dresser mirror. I'm starving, she realized, pushing her hair back from her face before rubbing the sleep from her eyes. Still in her long cotton nightshirt, she padded down to the kitchen, humming to herself. Hey, anybody home? No reply. She started to open the refrigerator, but stopped when she saw the morning mail on the kitchen counter. Shuffling through the stack of bills and mail order catalogs, she pulled out an envelope addressed to her. It was hand-printed in light blue ink. There was no return address. Curious, Corky struggled to tear open the envelope with her good hand. She pulled out a folded sheet of paper. It appeared to be a note. Who is it from? She wondered aloud. And then she gasped in horror as she unfolded it and read the brief message. It can't be drowned. End of Book 2. The nightmares never end when you visit Fear Street. Next, Cheerleaders the Third Evil. It can't be drowned. Corky Corcoran and the Shady Side High cheerleaders know the evil spirit is still with them, but where and in whom? A visit to cheerleader camp is a terrifying experience for Corky, Kimmy, Deborah, and Ronnie. Corky knows she must destroy the evil for good before any more of her close friends die. But this cheerleading season may be her last as Corky battles for her life against a spirit more evil than anyone ever imagined. I hope you have enjoyed this audio production of R.L. Stine's Cheerleaders the Second Evil. This audiobook was brought to you by Paris's Book Nook and was recorded by Paris. Thank you for listening. I look forward to seeing you at our third book, Cheerleaders the Third Evil.